Welcome to the Do London Differently podcast. This week we have a live recording interview with author Paul Wood, who's just published his new book called Tree Hunting. That is 1,000 trees to find in Britain and Ireland's towns and cities. He was interviewed during the London Walking Festival by Ranger Dipa Patel, and we had an audience throw in a few questions as well. Let's get straight into it.
London has been given the first ever national park city status.
London, the world's first national park city.
Come and enjoy, because life's too short, really and truly.
And London, wow, what an amazing city.
So, greener,
healthier,
and wilder.
So I am the aptly named Paul Wood, and I have been writing books about trees for about the last 10 years, and this is my fourth one, and it's the first one which gets me out of London, so beyond the M25, but London is still in here, so there's lots to talk about in London. My previous books have been London Street Trees and London Tree Walks, and also London is a Forest. I also did the map Great Trees of London, which you may have come across as well. But I'll leave it at that, and no doubt we can maybe delve into a bit more of my biography, and I'll pass over to Deepa.
Thank you. So I'm Dipa Patel. I'm a London National Park City Ranger for the Borough of Wandsworth. And with a couple of other rangers, Ranger and Greener and Emily, we lead walks around South London and around in the surrounding areas, all with different themes. We've actually done one of your walk as well, which has been great. So yeah, that's me.
Wow, I'm honoured.
Yeah. Well, shall we kick off?
Yeah, sure.
So first question is, what led you to trees and your career with trees?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting place to start, an obvious place to start as well, perhaps. So I've been interested in trees, I always say, all my life, but I think I can narrow it down to one event, really, which was a spring when I must have been about 12. So where I lived as a kid, behind all the houses was a wood, and all the local kids would go off to play in the wood, and it was an amazing natural playground, and I just took it for granted. And then one year, as I say, when I was about 12, this was the spring, the autumn before had been a mast year, and there was a giant beech tree literally behind our house, and you could hear the beech mast or the beech nuts falling through the leaves onto the ground. It was a cascade of beech nuts, and my parents were really fed up with it because it damaged the lawn and all the rest. Not that there was much of a lawn, to be honest, but it wasn't a great thing as far as they were concerned. I was just sort of amazed that this tree could produce this abundance of beech nuts. So to cut a long story short, and maybe we'll delve into that a bit more, but the following spring, where all the beech nuts had arrived, I started to notice these strange seedlings appearing out of the ground. And if anybody's seen a beech seedling before, because this is what they were, they're very strange looking things. They almost look like fungi. They have two cotyledon leaves, the first two leaves which come out of the nut, which are fan-shaped, nothing like the leaves of a beech tree, and they're fleshy. And I suddenly made this connection between this tiny, delicate thing that was growing out of the ground that one day would become a vast tree like the beech tree that grew behind the house, which may be 200 years old. And that just made me so many things start fizzing as a result of that. It was a wow moment. So that was, I think, how I got into trees.
That's a fantastic story. Love that. And so I guess you're quite an inquisitive person and quite aware of your surroundings, and you've moved from like the south, I guess, to London, and you've been here for a while. And what makes London a very interesting place for trees?
Well, I think London is the thing which I find fascinating, but well, I suppose going back to my childhood as well, I was fascinated by all the trees. I started to learn what all the different species were that you could find in the wood, and those were essentially beech, ash, sycamore, all these very common trees. And I was sort of really fascinated by all these things. I became an early member of the Woodland Trust. I think I was member 12,000 and something or something, which doesn't sound that early, but it seemed to be quite an unusual thing. And part of being a member of the Woodland Trust is you got this magazine which showed where all their woods were and told you what was growing in them. And one of the species which was iconic was the wild service tree. And the wild service tree is a rare tree which grows in ancient woodlands, and I'd never found one, and I was really desperate to see one of these wild service trees. And there was a wood that we used to drive past. My grandparents lived in Hull, and we had to drive up to Hull and we could see this wood. It was just by the A1, and I was always saying, we've got to stop and have a look for this wild service tree. My parents never stopped. But leading back to your question, I was always interested in these rare species. And then when I arrived in London, so I've been in London for many years, about 30 years, and what I discovered was that the trees which grow in London are very, very diverse. There are many, many different types of trees, and these aren't the trees that I knew half of what they were. And I think it was about 2011, I started writing a blog, thestreettree.com, which I still occasionally do. I did a post today, which is the first one for several months. But that blog led me to start questioning what all these trees were that grew on my street and so on. And I was just thinking, this is so fascinating. These species are like the ones you might see labelled in somewhere like Kew, but actually they're growing on the streets of London. And as I began to sort of get more interested and knowledgeable about them, I understood all these incredible stories of their provenance and how long they'd been here and what their features were in terms of whether they flowered and what was sort of particularly interesting about them. So I guess that was sort of how I became interested in London trees. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to sort of go back to what your question was, which was about
why London and why trees.
Yeah, so trees in London, I think, never cease to amaze because there are so many different ones, and you can walk down any street in central London and see, I think on Mortimer Street, there's ginkgos down the road, which is great. We're in Westminster. I also understood, as I started researching this more and more, that different boroughs planted different trees. And it almost seemed like it was this unregulated part of local government where the people who were planting trees in these London boroughs, because it comes down to the borough's responsibility to plant and manage trees, had their different proclivities, and they all fitted into these tree strategies and so on, but they were still allowed to sort of have stamp their own personality on it. And it was like nobody was checking their homework. And I thought that was amazing. And then I discovered Hackney, and then I was really blown away because Hackney has the most diverse trees I've ever seen in a city. It's unbelievable what grows in Hackney. So I think that's what happened. And then we were talking earlier about the types of trees that maybe people brought with them when they came to London from other countries, and how some of those have sort of taken off. And you can almost map these migration routes as a result of the species that you might see. So I think that's a really interesting thing to delve into as well, perhaps.
Yeah, really fascinating, because I guess in a way trees are like an entry point into the history of the area and of the people.
Yeah.
And a lot of them, I guess, stay still. Trees kind of stood still for many, many years whilst things around it have changed. And it's really great. I've looked at your website, and it's really nice that you've got some really cool names, especially in the book, for trees that you've come up with or communities have come up with. And it's almost that relationship that the communities have or people have with trees.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the naming of trees? Because it's kind of nice not to have that kind of those Latin names, but for people to come up with quite creative names and to invite people to come up with names and share them.
Yeah, so in tree hunting, there are 1,000 trees and each one has a unique name. So whilst I am a complete nerd and am fascinated by the species and want to know the Latin names of them, I appreciate that it's not for everybody. And I think that by giving trees familiar names that are maybe names which suggest how they look, where they grow, the history that's associated with them, those are ways that people can start recognising trees, specific individual trees. They can value them because of that. And also, I think ultimately that leads to better protection for them. So giving trees names, I think, is an important thing to do. And whilst I don't think I've got the, I've just given you a few provisional names. So my names are provisional. If you've got better names, I'm all for that. And I think that if I recorded a name, so we were talking about the Allerton oak, which is a fabulous oak tree in Liverpool. It's 400, 500 years old, a wonderful tree that grows in Calderstones Park. That tree has been known as the Allerton oak since whenever. I'm not going to mess with that name, but if you come across another tree that I think is still worthy of being recognised and valued, it's unlikely it's got a name because people might not have recognised it. So a good example is, I live in North London, and as I broke the news to you earlier, and in Finsbury Park, where I live, there's a wonderful almond tree on Stroud Green Road that has this weird spiralling trunk, which I don't know how it got that, but it also has incredible pink blossom every spring. It's the first tree to come into flower in February, and I've just called that the spiral almond. And I hope that by me giving it that name, people can say, yes, I know that tree, I recognise that tree. Maybe they have a different name for it, and I'd love to hear what that is. But if they haven't got a name for it, they just recognise it. By it then having a name, it sort of gives permission perhaps to people to value it and recognise it for what it is, a great landmark.
Yeah, and it is that developing a relationship with trees around, because when I got this book earlier this week, it was great to go through it and discover some trees around me or where I work in central London. But there's this one ash tree where I go and get the bus across the road from me, and there's a massive ash tree. And I know people are a bit funny about ash trees, but I like it, especially because it changes colour throughout the year. But in my head, I was like, oh, that's a bus stop ash.
Yeah.
So I've given it a name
That's
now.
brilliant.
I might
I've got a few bus stop trees as well. There's a bus stop plane in Cambridge, I think. And so, yes, I think those are the types of names which, that's a great starting point, isn't it? And then I think by it being the bus stop ash, it's then like someone else will tell you, oh, well, that's not a regular ash, that's a such and such an ash. And then it's somebody else might say, I've known that ash for all my life, and I've called it the corner shop ash or something like that. And I think those types of stories are amazing. And I'll tell you a really good story about that. So in Nottingham, there's a tree which is a bit like the Calderstones oak, the Allerton oak in Calderstones Park in Liverpool. It's called the arbor oak, and it's a fabulous multi-centurion oak tree growing in Wallerton Park in Nottingham. If anybody knows Nottingham, worth going to see. It's one that I'd read about before I went up to Nottingham, and I thought, I'm going to go, that's my first tree when I get to Nottingham. And I arrived and I found a woman underneath the tree who was communing with it, and she was stroking it, and I was thinking, I can't invade her space and her time with this tree, so I kind of just waited. And then I had a chat with her and sort of saying, it's a wonderful tree, isn't it? And she said, and she was quite an elderly lady, and she said, yeah, I've known this tree all my life, and I come to visit it every week. And I said, oh, it's the arbor oak. this was the name that I'd read, and she said, I'd never heard that. And she said, I just call it Big Tree. And I thought, that's great. I recorded it as the arbor oak, but I did make the point that someone else called it a big tree. So.
Yeah, that's cute. I like that. I will pass over to the audience, but maybe the last question is, obviously we're biased. London does trees incredibly well. Yeah. I think we all agree, probably the best city in the world for trees. But if we were looking outside, obviously you've been to different cities around the UK, even in Ireland.
Yeah.
What city would you say? I think you mentioned Liverpool as one of those quite green cities, but what other cities do you think are doing trees really well?
Well, I've got a few which I would say these are places to visit. Coventry, unlikely place, amazing city for trees. Dundee, another great place to go and see trees. A bit more predictably, perhaps, Bath, beautiful trees in Bath. Where else? I think Exeter was another great tree city. Southampton's really good. In the book, I've got 16 tree cities, and these are all major centres where I've picked at least 20 trees. So Liverpool is one of those, Manchester, Birmingham, Dublin. Dublin's a great place for trees. In fact, I was very keen to include Ireland in the book as well, because historically, the motivations for planting trees are cross boundaries, I think. And I thought it seemed crazy to have this little bit of Northern Ireland and not go to the rest of the island of Ireland. And I thought there were a lot of histories that could be told, which are around the histories of Britain and Ireland, which are so interconnected and intermingled, that they could be brought out in a way in the book. And I was also very keen to see a few trees in Ireland, so I thought that's a good excuse to put them in. So there's amazing trees in cities in lots of places, and I would recommend going to see these places. And what I hope the book will do is allow you to see the cities that you know well, particularly London, as we're talking about, as we're here as well, and we're all Londoners. It allows you, I hope, to start seeing the city in a new way. And if you find yourself in Nottingham or Birmingham, I also hope it might allow you to see Birmingham in a different way, and give you a reason to go and see parts of Birmingham you might never have gone to before. There are 2 trees in Handsworth, for instance, and those are amazing, some of the best trees in Birmingham, I think. And I tie them in with Benjamin Zephaniah, who was a native of Handsworth, and he was a great tree lover as well, and his family are now planting trees in his memory. So one of those trees is the poet's tree in Handsworth. So that's a Birmingham story.
Yeah, no, that's nice. I have to say, when I got this book, which is London Tree Walks, this was a really important book for me just after COVID. It really, the city can be quite busy, and obviously, COVID was a tough time for a lot of people. But this really just meant that I could go out and explore and find things, and it really kind of brings out the playfulness in a city where you're exploring, you're discovering. And actually there were a few times where I was like, am I looking at the right tree? But it's a really cool tree. I don't know if I found all the trees, but it did start to make me think differently. That's
probably my mistake rather.
Oh well, no, I'm not very good at
corrections are accepted.
Okay. Yeah, it was a really nice way of kind of exploring the city. So I think that's great. It's an entry point, isn't it, to kind of just kind of having a bit more of that.
And interesting, I wrote that book during COVID as well. So it was sort of like my COVID project, because it was like, what can I do? And this is an excuse to go and travel and see things without going too far. So.
And what a great book it is as well.
Oh, well, thank you.
I'll open up to the audience if anyone's got any questions.
I'll ask a question. What makes a tree that make your book when there's loads of trees that didn't? How do you choose which are the interesting ones or the?
Well, that was very tricky. there are lots of different considerations, I think, and I was looking at trees that were amazing looking, perhaps, or had great stories associated with them, or were very rare, or were very old, or were in positions that could tell a story about about the place where they were. They might have been connected to an individual, or they might be able to tell you something about that city in a different way. But then ultimately there were other considerations as well. So as I was saying back there earlier, geography was a key thing, and population. So the sort of connection between where people live and where should the trees be. So there are some places which don't have that many trees, but that's probably to do because there aren't so many people that live there. So for instance, the North Wales chapter doesn't have a tree city, and it covers a large area, and it's only got 30 or 40 trees, whereas in London I think we've got 90 trees, but the population is a lot larger. So I was trying to correlate where people live, because it's very important to me that the book is about accessibility for most people, so they can see towns and cities in a way which is new, and also they can find these wonderful trees which grow on their doorstep. But also I feel like it's a starting point. So I've got 1,000. I could have done 2,000, and I'm sure other people have trees which they can add to this canon, and I'd love to hear about them as well.
How do you even go about finding them in the first place?
How do I go about finding them? So that was a lot of research. So initially I would spend a lot of time researching. So there are good databases like the Ancient Tree Inventory by the Woodland Trust, which is a great resource, citizen science resource, where people can record trees in their neighbourhoods and so on, and they're particularly interested in veteran trees and ancient trees. And then there's the Tree Register of Britain and Ireland, which is a membership organisation where people have recorded what are known as champions, and those are the biggest, the largest, the best examples of specific species growing throughout Britain and Ireland. And those are all different species, and it's kind of recorded by experts. So those two were the databases I was looking at, and they both have tens of thousands of entries. And as I got into the process of walking around or travelling around, and I think I did about 30,000 miles in researching this book, which was pretty intense, I have to say, you begin to realise where are the good places where you can find trees, and those are old parks, old cemeteries. So most of our towns and cities are essentially 19th century. They're Victorian or Edwardian, early 20th century. There are a few exceptions. Places like Bath and bits of Liverpool, for instance, are Georgian. But otherwise, most of these places that we live in are relatively young compared to, say, ancient woodlands that grow out there outside the cities. And therefore the trees which are in the cities tend to be ones which humans have planted in the last 200 years or more recently, and as a result they are these more unusual species. So I have to say, being a Londoner, and I love London plains, as I'm sure everybody here does, except for the 2 weeks that caused me to splutter, as Mariam has witnessed when being on a couple of events with her recently, when she was advising me on what medication to ask at the pharmacist, which I still haven't done, I'm afraid. But so London plains, I think, are particularly interesting, and they are a peculiarly urban tree. So you don't get London plains in the wild. They're a hybrid between two species which come from different continents. So it was humans that caused them to hybridize and produce this hybrid species, which is a mainstay of most British towns and cities. But the further north you get, the less well it does. So if you go to Edinburgh, there are a few London planes there, and in Glasgow there's one or two, but they're kind of a little bit, they're not looking, they're more stumpy. And I've saw 2 in Dundee, I think, and then you get to Aberdeen, no London planes. So you can see this sort of climatic difference as well.
That's really interesting, because we were talking about London planes earlier, and almost like, I feel like they're almost a victim of their own success, especially with the climate changing and now new diseases, I guess, that are being passed from plane to plane.
Yeah.
And there's questions around that, quite controversial questions around whether some of them should be felled or not, or, you know, what happens with planes. But then what happens next? I mean, you know, if the climate does change and maybe we can grow more planes up north, what do we replace planes with in London?
I think the climatic impact on planes is going to be more to do with the diseases and pathogens which are able to travel because of climate change, rather than affecting the planes per se, because planes grow in Spain and France quite happily. Well, not so happily because the pathogens are there, but that's the problem. Those are the things which are probably going to impact plane trees in the future. So I think, what do we see? What sort of trees might we see planted in the future? And we're already seeing those going in. So trees which are particularly prevalent in cities now are things like the dawn redwood, which is the wonderful conifer, which is deciduous, so it drops its needles in the winter. And there's great examples in London, some of the biggest. That's a tree that's only been in the West since 1947, but I think that's one we're going to see a lot more of. Japanese pagoda tree, another tree which I think is going to be quite climate resilient. But I think the way that climate modelling now looks is it's more likely that London will have a sort of more continental climate with warmer summers but cooler winters. So the Mediterranean type species that maybe some people are sort of fantasising we might be able to have everywhere are probably not the species which will be successful, and we need to be looking at trees from more continental type climatic places where there is cooler winters. These might be sort of altitude based. And then the other thing that we might need to think about is sourcing seeds from further south of familiar plants. So for instance, the genetic diversity of tree species can vary dramatically depending on where they're sourced and where they've grown. So Quercus robur, the pedunculate oak, the common oak of England, is one that grows as far south as Spain. But so the seeds which come from Spanish examples of Quercus robur probably have the genetic data in them to be able to withstand climate that might happen here in the future. So that's probably what we want to do. And then someone was telling me the other day, very interestingly, I think it was in Coventry actually, where they're growing trees from seed, but they're sourcing those seeds from something like 300 miles further south than Coventry, because they think the climate in the future will be like that in 30 years. So that is maybe a thing to do. But in terms of the species that we might see, I mentioned a couple there, but I think another one which is being planted a lot, which is a quite glamorous one, is the crepe myrtle, which is an Asian species which has dramatic flowers. It's almost, and has all these different colorways. It has different cultivars, and the flowers can be from white through to deep magenta and purple with red and pink in between. And those are trees which are already growing in North American cities and in cities in further south in Europe. And that's one that's being planted a lot in the UK now, although it doesn't flower that well yet, but in a few years it probably will do, because it will be built, that resilience to this climate that we might be looking at is probably what it wants.
Amazing. So maybe more avocado trees.
Yeah, exactly.
That would be great.
I'll tell you what my favourite tree is now.
Yeah.
It's the Allerton oak.
Almost like what is your favourite tree?
Well, it's a very tricky question because I never know what my favourite tree is. I'm a Libran and I can't make up my mind. So essentially, it is a tree which I've been thinking about very recently, and I think that's a wonderful tree. It's one that is dependent on season and it's dependent on location. And I think because we were talking about the Allerton oak, that is a really fabulous tree. One of the best urban trees I can think of in the UK, grows in Liverpool. That's my favourite tree at the moment.
What's the most surprising tree you think in the book? That actually might be a surprise when people discover it.
Yeah.
Or even a surprise for you to come across it.
Well, there were 2 or 3 trees and I didn't know what they were, and that was quite surprising because I thought I knew quite a lot about trees, and then when you come across a species and you think, oh, I just don't know what that is. And there were 2 of those that spring to mind. The first is in Glasgow, and I love Glasgow, but it was a sort of unlikely place to find a tree that was this rare species which I'd never heard of before. It's castor oil tree, Calipanax, and it was quite a big tree growing. It was in the Botanic Gardens, admittedly, but the Botanic Gardens in Glasgow, if anybody's been there, it's more like a public park, so it's free to enter, and they have got botanical collections and things are labelled, and they have some quite old trees there. But this one is spectacular. It grows right in front of this wonderful Victorian glass house. It has leaves a bit like a maple, but they're glossier and so on. And I just thought, I have no idea what this is. Fortunately, it had its label on. And even then I thought, I still have no idea what this is, so I have to look that up. And another one was in Swansea, another great place to go and see trees, I should say, which was a Dipa. A Dipa is from South America, and I've still never ever seen another one of those. And it was a huge, looked almost like a sort of tropical rainforest tree. It had buttressed trunk at the bottom and so on. It was dramatic and surprising, and in Swansea.
That's amazing. Michael, what's your favourite tree?
My favourite tree?
Yeah.
I quite enjoyed the lemon tree that you did there, only because that kind of sprung out a little story and the little film that we made, and I didn't think you could grow lemon trees in the middle of Shoreditch, but it turns out you can.
For that story, I should just expand on it a bit, is Michael and Michael made a film of me and Ranger Divya, who is Fruity Walks, and everybody knows Divya, and for one of my books last year that was republished, the publisher paid for a lemon tree to be planted in Shoreditch. So Michael thought it would be great to do a film of this lemon tree, and a sort of talk between me and Divya looking at this and going and looking for other trees. So we did a walk through the city. Unfortunately, it was in March and I was just recovering from flu, and I think I was feeling a bit rough, but the lemon tree was there, and it's still there. It's flowering and should be fruiting as well. It grows in Shoreditch particularly because of the urban heat island effect. So the urban heat island causes the city to warm up during the day and release that heat during the night, which can be 5 to 10 degrees warmer than the surrounding countryside. So it allows trees which might be regarded as tender to grow in the city centre, and Shoreditch is particularly prevalent. The urban heat island is particularly prevalent there.
Wow. Well, big shout out to Divya as well. Don't know if everyone knows her, but she does Fruity Walks. She's also a London National Park City Ranger. Really worth going on one of her walks. Sorry, I think Tony had his hand up at the back.
You've already mentioned about 50 different species that I've never heard of. Do you know how many species are in the book?
I do.
Is there a species that features more than any other species? Is there a winner?
Well, I don't know whether I'd regard it as a winner. Maybe that's something to debate. But there are, of the 1,000 trees, there are 236 different species and cultivars in here. But there are a lot of oak trees, there are a lot of yew trees, there are a lot of the more commoner trees. But I think the one which probably is the overall winner is the London plane.
Amazing.
Just going back to the fruit trees, I haven't heard of your range, so I will look that up. But
Yeah.
I've done some work with the orchard project in our local park, and so we had those conversations about what trees should we be planting now for 30 years cycle.
Yeah.
But there's obviously a difference between orchards and street trees. So I wonder if you had any your favourite street fruit trees.
Yeah. Well, I think street fruit trees is an interesting one. I mean, I suppose the one that the species that I would always think of as a great street fruit tree might be the mulberry, which is there aren't that many of them, but I love mulberries. And the reason I would say that is because I think more people should taste the mulberry fruit because it is delicious. And it requires you to pick it off the tree and eat it straight away. You can't really keep it. So it's a rare pleasure that should be democratised and given to everybody, I think.
And briefly, I think in this book you mentioned the mulberry, the history of the mulberry tree and how it ended up in the UK.
Yeah.
Do you want to maybe just kind of...
Okay, well actually...
Because it's fascinating.
There's quite a few mulberry trees in this book as well, and London has more mulberry trees than anywhere else. And in a way, you might regard, although London plane is obviously the tree of London, a runner-up is the mulberry. And there are two species of mulberry, the black mulberry and the white mulberry. The black mulberry is the one with the delicious fruit. And the white mulberry is the species which silkworms consume. And there is what might be regarded as an urban myth, perhaps, which is how the mulberries were first arrived in England, which was through the efforts of James I on 6th of Scotland, who, when he came to the English throne, thought, I want to boost the economy and I'll set up an English silk industry, as there were already blossoming silk industries in France and Italy and so on. So in order to do that, needed to bring white mulberry trees to Britain in order to have the fruit, have the leaves for the silkworms to eat. Famously, the silk industry never took off, and the urban myth says that it was because he imported the wrong species, which was the black mulberry rather than the white mulberry. But I think this is probably a bit more nuanced than that. And what seems to be the case is that he did import the white mulberry as well as the black mulberry, but white mulberries haven't survived as long. So maybe there was a climatic catastrophe at some point, which probably freezing temperatures in the 18th century, which probably meant that white mulberries died out. There is one very old white mulberry tree in Oxford Botanic Gardens, but otherwise they're really rather rare. But there are some very old mulberry trees, one of which is at Charlton House in southeast London, which is possibly the oldest one in the country, which could be a survivor from James I's day and could be one of the trees which he imported. And I think the reason why the silk industry never took off wasn't perhaps to do with the wrong plant. It was probably to do with human expertise not being here. But it's a very, very interesting story. And I think mulberries, as a result, we have quite a lot of mulberries in London. And the other myth, which is sort of worth busting perhaps, is that black mulberries have actually been here since the Roman times, because we've seen them in archaeological remains. So what that means is that mulberry trees are effectively an archaeophyte. And an archaeophyte is a species which has been here for a very long time that isn't regarded as native, which is a complex and contested area that we could maybe discuss as well. But the archaeophyte is a species which would have arrived in antiquity. There's no record. So black mulberry, sweet chestnut, various species, and apples, for instance, were species which have arrived through human intervention, but we don't really know when. And the other interesting thing about the black mulberry is we don't really know where it's from, because it's been so connected to human existence for generations, but it's thought maybe it comes from Central Asia, and it's sort of followed human migrations along the Silk Road and so on. That is how it's arrived in Europe. So trees have these fascinating stories of movement as well, which human aided, and embedded in those are these stories of migration and historic migrations as well.
So there's a mention of a mulberry tree in Milton Keynes on the campus of the Open University,
yes.
which I thought that was the one tree that got mentioned for Milton Keynes. But I was like, how did that end up there? But I guess it was it must have been before Milton Keynes was built up.
Yeah, I think so.
It's got some kind of history to it, but I'd love to know, kind of see how that happened.
It's a very good mulberry, quite an old one, and I was really surprised to see it. So I don't know if anybody's been to the Open University campus in Milton Keynes, but at the centre of it is an old house. So I think it must have been, which is how I think trees have survived in parks and so on. So you often get, the former landscape would have things associated with its own gardens. So in Milton Keynes, before it was Milton Keynes, were fields and aristocratic estates and so on. And one of those aristocratic estates became the Open University and its gardens. I think I'm guessing somewhat, but I think that's what must have happened.
Okay, so I wonder if people can just go there and pick fruits.
Yeah, they can.
They
you can just walk through the campus. I'll tell you where some other great mulberries are.
Yeah.
So there's a brilliant one in Lewisham on Pine Tree Way.
I think I've seen it. Is it kind of not cornered off, but
Yes,
it's been an estate?
So, So, and ludicrously, a mulberry tree on Pine Tree Way as well. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
There's some really good ones in St James's Park. St James's Park has a lot of mulberries, and there's a white mulberry in there for you to see as well. And I would recommend looking at Peter Coles, who's the mulberry expert, and he's written a book called Mulberry, and it goes into great detail about all these things. And he runs regular walks in London looking at the mulberry heritage. So I've learned a lot from Peter.
Yes, I've been meaning to go on one of his walks actually. Enough about mulberry trees. I guess we could do that. Could be a whole different.
Well, why don't I ask you what your favourite tree is, or what it was that about trees that got you interested in this, Dipa? Because you've obviously you agreed to interview me, so I think you must have had some interest in the topic. And
yeah, I think it's Lockdown. I think it's your book. I think also my favourite tree is now actually the bus stop ash.
Yeah.
I think because I've got a relationship with it. I get the bus every morning and it's like my reason to get up and out and stand under a tree. I actually grew up in Malaysia, so part of our PE lesson was to go jungle trekking.
Oh, really?
And I think that was, we were swinging on lianas and kind of having it was a very different experience, I guess, to PE here. And that playfulness, I think, was quite nice. And I lost that, I think, when I came here. I actually spent a lot of time in Milton Keynes. And then it was only post-lockdown, kind of going out and walking and slowing down. And I think in the pace of the city, that's quite fast, being more observant to trees. And I think, actually, my favourite trees would be the yew trees on Box Hill.
Okay.
They're quite gnarly. They're quite wild. I think I'd only ever really seen quite yew trees in stately homes or used as fencing. Yeah. But this walk through Box Hill, and I think it's not really a part that many people go, but there's some really, really gnarly, wild-looking yew trees. And then I think finding out more about yew trees, I think Tony has also told me quite a lot about yew trees as well, and how their branches go down, and you could have multiple trees in one space, and it could all just be from one tree. Yeah, almost. Just the wildness of them, I think, and also some of the more kind of folky stories around them. I think has just made me in awe of them.
They're fascinating trees. I completely agree, and because they're so long lived as well. Yeah. And I've got 2 mulberry trees in London for you to see. One's Totteridge Church at Totteridge, 1,000-year-old tree, and the other one's at Down, which is just in Bromley, which is where Charles Darwin grew up, and it's a really ancient yew tree in the churchyard there as well.
So that could be a new book. The more the Paul Wood does mulberry trees. Any more questions from the audience?
We keep talking about London planes, and I don't know, this is slightly tangential, but the French do planes, but they really butcher them, don't they? To an English eye. Well, they really deal with them, don't they? They, I don't know what the technical term is.
Pollard, yeah.
Are they? Is that the same plane tree?
It is. So the history of plane is quite interesting. So the French will obviously call them La Platane, not La Plane de Londres. And the reason why we call them London planes is because they were planted so abundantly in London in the late 19th century. But actually we pinched the idea of planting them in formal ways on avenues and in streets and so on from the French. So if you go to Paris, the Grand Boulevards in the centre of Paris, which were reconstructed in 1850 by Haussmann, those were the original plane tree boulevards that we then used as the model in London. And those trees aren't pollarded like the ones that you're referring to, which I think you tend to see further south, so in towns and so on, where they will be very, very manicured. And I think it's interesting you see it in those sort of as a cultural difference between how the English deal with them and the French deal with them. And I'm sure there's something in that. And I always find it interesting when people complain about how they are pollarded here, and they're not pollarded to the same severity that they are in some French places. I also think there's a sort of notion of neatness that we once had about how we should manage our trees, which is probably closer to that French model. And actually, if you look at very old planes, you can often see where they've been managed historically by the knots in the branches, and you can see that they would have been cut a lot lower. And it's over a period of decades that we've gradually become more laissez-faire about how we manage our plane trees, I think. So yes, it's interesting, but the same thing, yeah. Yes.
So yeah, you jogged my imagination on something. So talking about management, because some of my favourite trees are trees that are no longer standing, so like fallen dead wood, because they support so many other types of wildlife. I just wondered, do you have any dead trees in your book at all?
No, I don't. I'm afraid. Well, I sort of, because the process of creating this book took so long, it was 5 years, I lost quite a few trees during that period, not least the sycamore gap tree, which was going to be in here. And there were quite a few others. And we kind of took the view that there might be an in memoriam bit at the back, but I didn't want to have trees which were X trees. But I think what you're getting at is slightly different. It's more like there's a huge benefit for X trees that are to do with the diversity, the biodiversity which they support, which are other life, more than human, more than arboreal life, which they support. So if you think about leaving dead wood standing, that can be a really important habitat for so many other creatures. I felt like that didn't really fit into the format of the book, but I understand why you're saying it. I think it's a really good point. But there are lots of trees which are, haven't got much longer. So they also support great biodiversity. So, for instance, the Allerton oak in Liverpool, which is 400 or 500 years old, is middle-aged in oak terms. But there are other trees like there's another really, really ancient oak tree. Well, it's an ancient sweet chestnut tree, Tortworth sweet chestnut tree, which is in Gloucestershire, and it's thought to be 1,000 years old, but it's probably only got another 100 years or so before that would reach the natural end of its life. But that 100 years is so important for so many other life forms that it can support in that at the very end of its life. So I celebrate those living on their last legs trees as well.
What is the word for them when they're
senescent? I think is.
Oh, okay. What's it?
Oh well, there's veterans and ancient trees.
And
is a distinction. Monumental trees are sort of dead trees which are left in the landscape.
Yeah.
So that doesn't necessarily mean that they're ancient or veteran, though.
Okay.
So there's sort of quite a few of these slightly tricky terms. There is a glossary in the book, by the way, which kind of goes through some of these. So ancient and veterans are terms that we use for trees. They're the age as the trees are. So veteran trees are old for their species, and ancient trees are really old for their species. So in oak terms, a veteran tree is 800 to 1,000 years. An ancient tree is 800 to 1,000 years old, and that will be exhibiting collapsing branches, and it will be really hollow, and it will be, you would think this is hasn't got much longer to go. And a veteran tree would be something like the Allerton oak, which is in rude health but very old, and has centuries yet to go. But when you look at another species, such as a birch tree, which is a relatively short-lived species, you can still get veteran and ancient birch trees, but that process is much more speeded up. So an ancient birch tree might be 100 years old, whereas a veteran one might be 70 or 80. So it's relative.
And I guess it's interesting as well, because I guess if you're talking about management or managing trees, pollarding does actually extend the life of some of these trees. So it's actually quite beneficial.
Yeah.
Where I think sometimes some people get quite angry about pollarding. It does actually mean that trees can survive for much longer.
It does. And I think that, I suppose that, there's management practices which are traditional and sustainable, which are traditionally ways which we've harvested wood and timber from our woodlands. For instance, all the ancient woodlands in London, which are wonderful, and I'm sure many people have been to places like Oxley's Wood and Sydenham Hill Woods and Highgate Woods and Hampstead Heath, they show how these woodlands were managed in the past in order to provide Londoners with fuel for their fires and so on. And that would be through this coppicing or pollarding. Not so much the pollarding in London, although Epping Forest is a great place to go and see pollards. And pollards were ones that were cut at head height so that they were above the browse line of animals that lived around them. And in fact, Richmond Park is another great place to see pollarded oak trees. So coppicing, where it's cut right at the bottom, and in fact I think coppicing can make a tree last longer than pollarding because you're cutting it so far back. And in fact Lesnies Abbey Wood is a great place to see ancient coppice stools, and a coppice stool is where it gets cut back over, probably every 10 to 20 years, and that's happened over perhaps even millennia. So a tree species like an oak tree, which might last 1,000 years if it's just left to grow, could be much older because it's been cut back. And you can see this vast stool, which is, in some cases as big as this room, which is an incredible thing. I've got some great ones in Sheffield of those, actually, which would feature in the book.
Amazing. I guess that goes back to the history of London and what was happening around London before. I guess now a lot of like the common lands and the woodlands as well, and how people were using it. And now I guess people are using them in different ways. But
yeah, I think so. Yes, I think particularly how we used to live with trees as humans, and particularly when London was smaller, those woodlands would have been very important. And I mentioned Sheffield there as well, which is a very interesting city for trees, and no doubt many of you will be aware of the tree protests that took place in the early 2000s that we're all about saving the street trees, but Sheffield surprisingly has a lot of ancient woodland within its city limits, which has survived because Sheffield was so reliant on the wood to fuel the metallurgical industries which it grew up on before coal was abundant there. So it's a very interesting place to look at the history of woodlands, I think.
When does a tree become native? How long's it got to be growing in this country?
Right, how much longer have we got? That's a can of worms. Yeah. So I think these terms are I think we need to rethink those terms of native and non-native. To me, it seems they're a bit arbitrary. So if you were to ask a sort of strict academic view of what's native and non-native, it's defined by the pollen record after the last ice age. But that denies what plants were here before the ice age. And a good example that I always think of is the monkey puzzle, Araucaria araucana, which is a tree now restricted to the Pacific littoral of Chile. But at one time it grew in Yorkshire. That means that, I think, how do we call that a non-native tree in one way? Even though it was, what is it that makes the Ice Age this sort of point where we can define this native and non-nativeness? And I understand, why academics or academically why we put that line in the sand, but it also denies migration after the Ice Age. So we were talking about mulberries and how they would have arrived maybe with the Romans. Apple trees, again, a very, very long time ago. There are many species which are known as archaeophytes, which are so familiar to say, oh, the horse chestnut or the sycamore, these are non-native, gives them a stigma which is unnecessary. And I think we need to rethink how we've sort of come up with that very rigorous rule. And maybe we need to think about things which are damaging the environment and things which aren't. And that's a much better way to look at this rather than to have this sort of timeline effect of nativism, which is, I think, wrong-headed.
So is there any suggestions of other words that maybe you've thought about that might be better?
Well, no, is the short answer. Yeah. But I'm very open to discussing this a lot more, and I think it's a very, very critical thing that we do. And I feel that, a way to think about it might be to do with invasiveness. So invasiveness is when a plant can become damaging to existing environments and so on. And some species that might be also called non-native can do that. And again, that's then tying this invasiveness in with this term, which becomes catch-all. But not all non-native plants are invasive, and in fact, very, very few are. So it's very interesting. And we were talking earlier about the sort of routes of migration and how plants have arrived here. So we were talking about the avocados, for instance, and all these sort of wonderful trees which might have arrived here and have been planted by individuals in their gardens or whatever. And I live in Finsbury Park, as I say, and you can almost see this notion of the migration of the Greek and Turkish communities there by the loquat trees which grow in houses there in lots of gardens, which must, I'm assuming, have come with people that came from Cyprus. And those are now quite elderly, and the community is still there to an extent, but a lot have moved on. And that shows this sort of, you could almost map that sort of migration route, I think. So, but the ones which have become invasive and difficult, we were talking about rhododendron, which I also claimed was a bush and was therefore not my responsibility, but I'm going to own it now. So that was a Rhododendron ponticum, which originates from the Black Sea coast in around Turkey and sort of the Caucasus, which in particularly acid soil regions, not so much in London, has become incredibly invasive in ancient woodlands. And the reason why that has become incredibly invasive is because it was encouraged by large landowners who wanted to provide cover for game, often pheasants, which they were then shooting for pleasure. And those sorts of stories, I think, also need to be told within that migration story of plants.
Yeah, I guess like you say, people have brought these things over, and I guess also nature has also done its job in bringing some things over.
Exactly, and I think that's something that we shouldn't deny. So, we assume that humans have brought all these in species, but that isn't necessarily the case. Wind-borne seeds could quite easily float across the channel in the high atmosphere. Branches could, equally end up on the East Anglian coast that fell off a tree in Denmark or something like that. There is a continuous migration of plants, and I think that's also to do with our island mentality. Yeah. We somehow think that because we're surrounded by water, that things can't get across it. But, that's also denying the inherent intelligence of plants.
Yeah, nature without borders.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any more questions? Okay. I've got one.
Yeah.
Actually, I've still got loads. So when we're looking at the community and community involvement in tree planting and, tree planning, I guess, in the city, there's some really good examples, and a couple that you've actually mentioned in some of your books. Is it the Living Street?
Street Trees for Living.
Street Trees for Living, which is a great example. Yeah. Started in Lewisham, and now has kind of spread around. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
And why it's a good example?
So they're a really wonderful organisation. I don't know if anybody lives in Lewisham, but if you're probably aware of them if you have. And they started just in Brockley, and then they've expanded to the borough of Lewisham, and now I think they're in Southwark and Lambeth as well. That was a sort of citizen-led project to plant more street trees in Lewisham because the council was broke. They didn't really have the money to plant trees. So they raised the money and said to the council, we'll raise the money within the community to plant the trees and we'll look after them. So they've constructed this whole infrastructure which enables the community to have a voice of what's going to be planted where, but also to maintain those trees. And there's a wonderful statistic where trees which have been managed by Street Trees for Living, when young trees are planted in street trees, a lot of them die. And it's thought to be about 30% will die because they're not watered enough, they're not looked after. But in Lewisham, it's 5%. And that's because the Street Trees for Living have mobilised the community to look after the trees, and it's such a great model for elsewhere, I think.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I think that's I guess we were talking about Sheffield as well, and how the community kind of came together. I guess there is this council versus a community, but that's a nice example of actually the community and the council coming together in planting trees.
And I think the council love them because they are doing this thing which the council couldn't do. The council have agreed to support the trees after they've established, so they're working in partnership with the council. I also think because it's citizen-led, it's much more like there's not the them and us. It's kind of like it's collaborative, so I think that's good as well.
Any other examples around the UK that you think there's like a good community involvement?
I think things like that are happening elsewhere. I'm not entirely aware of where that's happening, but I'll tell you I met a woman in Glasgow who it's not so much about actually caring for the trees, but it's more about celebrating them. And I know Glasgow very well. I used to go there a lot as a child. My father was from Glasgow, so my grandmother lived there, and I went and spent a lot of time. And there was a park which I used to go to called Maxwell Park in the south side of Glasgow. It's a lovely park. And I thought I knew this park quite well. And this woman, Jessica, got in touch with me and said, I want to show you this tree in Maxwell Park. And so we went to see it, and it was this amazing tree. And she's a musician, and she's doing this thing about tree stories, which she's translating into music. And all over Scotland, she's doing performances of musical compositions which are under the trees and inspired by the trees and people's stories of the trees. So she was amazing, and she showed me a wonderful tree known as the Climber's Lime.
Oh, that's nice. We do in Tooting, we have a choir that sing in the woods.
Yeah.
In Tooting Woods. I don't know if you...
I don't know.
I haven't heard them yet. I've kind of like been wanting to...
Yeah.
But yeah, they practice in the woods, which I think is really nice. Just my final question for Paul is, if you're looking into the future and, you know, you're looking to Treetopia, what would that look like?
Well, I think the first thing is protection, and I think legal protection is the thing which we need for urban trees particularly. And I think there's the case of the Oakfield Road Plain in Haringey, which is being threatened again, which had people sleeping in it and so on. So what I would like to see is a law which gives similar protections to trees as buildings get through listing.
Yep.
So there is a bill which has been private members' bill in the House of Lords, which is called the Heritage Trees Bill, which is being debated, but it's unlikely it will get very far. It needs to be adopted by the government. So that would be high up on my priority list. And then I think in terms of what it might look like, I mean, I would love to see more canopy cover, more embracing of large trees in cities, and I think being able to see a green canopy that is expanded over all parts of the city. So we've also got, and this is historic, this is in most British cities actually, where there is the tree equity is very much geared towards wealthier places, and that needs to be more fairly distributed, I think. So, and you can see it in London, where the leafy west has many more historic, large, big old trees than, you know, further out in East London, for instance. So that's repeated in cities, and I know an academic in Dublin who's done a lot of research into that, and he had a map showing how that is exactly the case in Dublin as well. So that greater access to trees for all, protection for trees, and more trees.
Great. And the books are a good way into that.
They're the gateway drug.
To trees and everything else. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
That's great.
So if you did want to pick up a copy of Paul's new book, Tree Hunting, it is, of course, available at all good booksellers. But I do want to put a little shout out to Stanford's Travel, especially Beth from Stanford's, who came down and brought some books for Paul to sign and for people to purchase on the evening. So that's Stanford's Travel, just off Covent Garden. If you haven't been there, it's a wonderful place to visit.
Come and enjoy, because life's too short, really and truly.
And London, wow, what an amazing city.
So, greener,
healthier,
and wilder.